Hello, my name is Biery, and this is The Power of One. We live in a time when our idea of community is frayed, strained due to busy lives, challenged by the political landscape and competing responsibilities. Some of us believe that getting involved will not change anything, that being civically involved will just lead to defeat and frustration. But what does it mean to feel empowered enough to take action on an issue of concern, to get involved in a cause that is bigger than ourselves? Fortunately, however, there are many people in our community who are doing something about the conditions in which we live. They are creative and dynamic individuals who are fighting for what is right and for better lives for everyone. This program will show you that one person can make a difference, that the power of one is within all of us. Welcome to the Power of One. My guest today, fortunately, is Edina Lekovic, and she's a consultant with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So thank you very much for being here today, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you in the studio. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your current position and then kind of the pathway that brought you there.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. So the Muslim Public Affairs Council is an organization that's been around for almost 30 years. It's a national policy advocacy group that works on behalf of American Muslims. And since day one, it's been focused on a couple of things. One is the idea of promoting what we call the American Muslim identity, the idea that you can be fully American and fully Muslim at the same time, and that those two identities are complementary, not competitive. And then we work with government, media, and Hollywood, because these are the nerve centers of public policy and public opinion. And we work with decision makers in each of those fields to help them basically make better decisions on the issues that impact our communities. Or at least that's how we started. We used to be much more focused on Muslim issues, but in the last decade, we have expanded to broader issues that impact multiple vulnerable communities. And so we do a great deal of work with Japanese Americans, with African Americans, with Latino communities, and even with the LGBTQ community, because the same rights that are threatened for folks in our community are also on the line for so many other Americans. So I've worked with the organization now for 12 years, primarily as a communications professional. And the way I got there, I guess by way of background, is growing up, my parents are from the former Yugoslavia, and so they left in the 70s. They moved to Austria. They lived there for 8 years. My sister and I were born there, and my parents decided, well, we're never going to be fully Austrian, because the society didn't, anybody who was not, purely Austrian was a foreigner. And so they reinvented their lives for the second time and came to the States. I grew up in San Diego, where I fell in love with the evening news, because I wasn't allowed to watch much television growing up, and the exception was the evening news.
They did allow you to watch the
Yes,
news.
so I remember being wedged between my parents on our brown plaid couch, I think that everyone had, and watching the evening news with Peter Jennings. And
I was going to say if you had a favorite.
Oh yeah, and so I fell in love with Peter Jennings, and I fell in love with the power of storytelling. So my love of media and journalism was planted in me probably when I was 7 or 8 years old. And so I aspired to have a career in the media, and I was that nerd that was my high school newspaper editor. I went to UCLA. At UCLA, I worked my way up in the student newspaper and became the editor of the Daily Bruin. And around that same time, my family was sort of secular or cultural growing up. We were Muslim. My family's been Muslim for generations, but it wasn't something that we held too tightly growing up. And so it was when I was in college at UCLA that I kind of went on my own spiritual journey, decided I wanted to be Muslim, and that's when I started covering my hair. So by the time I graduated and wanted to work in broadcast journalism, I was told in no uncertain terms that there just wasn't a place for me as a woman who wears hijab to be a reporter in front of the camera. So at 22, I had a decision to make around whether I would choose my scarf or choose my dream. And at the time, I didn't think that there was a way that I could find a way to make both work. And so I chose to hold on to my scarf and to find a way to work within advocacy. And so this position that came along at the Muslim Public Affairs Council was ideal, because it gave me the opportunity to work with media professionals to help change the conditions that had prevented me from pursuing a career in this area. And ironically, I've ended up being on
keeping the scarf.
Keeping the scarf, and ironically being in front of cameras, because as a communications professional in the Muslim community, I get called on for national news interviews to provide a voice for American Muslims. So life has unexpected journeys.
Yeah, but I think that shows that if we're really true to our values and true to ourselves, then the world or the universe has a way of pushing us toward what really is best for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, they say life only makes sense when you're looking backwards, right? That your journey, everything stacks up on top of each other, and I certainly feel that way. I couldn't be more pleased with with the opportunities I've had to be able to advocate not just on behalf of my own community, but to find my own voice in the process.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about media and communications in a few minutes. We'll go back to Peter Jennings. We'll check in on him. But before that, I wanted to sort of dig in more about why the council is so necessary. And so why do you think Islam in particular and the Muslim experience is so misunderstood in the United States? Why are there so many misperceptions about it?
This is a short show, so there's only so much I can say on this subject. But I think that mistrust and suspicion towards Islam and Muslims, it predates 9/11. In the pre-9/11 world, it used to be called Orientalism. This idea that things that come from the East are exotic and foreign, and Islam
perhaps dangerous,
right? And that Islam was lumped in within that. And when you think about Hollywood portrayals of Islam and Muslims pre-9/11, you would have the greedy oil sheikh, or still, some sort of terrorist, or some sort of
nefarious,
or some sort of docile, silent, oppressed Muslim woman, right? And so these stereotypes predate 9/11, and yet since 9/11, when we think about the amount of media coverage that Islam and Muslims have received, it is, it's exponential. But the vast majority of it is bad news. And, with a news media background, I know that just like my high school newspaper teacher taught me, she used to say, dog bites man isn't a story, man bites dog is. And I think that that's pretty much succinctly tells us what's going on with mainstream media is it's not the things that work that make news, it's the things that are broken that make news. Yeah. And so when we look at the coverage of Islam and Muslims, it's almost entirely through the lens of terrorism, national security, or in the best case, sadly, the best case scenario is when you have Muslims who defy the stereotype, right? Or who have been subjected to hate crimes or hate incidents. And so the realm of what's possible when we're looking at news media coverage of this faith community shows that Muslims can be perpetrators, or they can be victims, or they're defying the stereotype. And so we're still, those of us who are mainstream, which is the vast majority, we're still set against the stereotype. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges. So why does this continue to persist? Well, I think it's critical that we think about, what percentage of Americans actually knows a Muslim firsthand. And we know that just 38% of Americans say that they know a Muslim firsthand.
And is that because the population is so small of Muslims that it's disparate? And
that's right. So let's compare that to, so 38% of Americans say that they know a Muslim. Well, just 1% of Americans are Muslim. So I used to feel very depressed about this, thinking, 62% of Americans don't know a Muslim. But in reality, the fact that 38% know some portion of this 1%, we're not doing so badly. But I point to this because exposure is everything. It's when you know somebody of a different background that your ideas get challenged, that your ideas that are fed to you by media or by other sources are challenged. There's nothing like, the first time that I had a gay friend or had a friend of a different ethnicity or a different culture, to be able to break through some of the ideas that I held.
Yeah. And it's that relationship building and that seeing the other as similar to you, or that you have something in common, instead of ostracizing, or instead of, I think what the media does, as you were saying, paints a very grim picture. And so that automatic assumption or stereotype persists. Mm-hmm. So are you going to go on a walking tour around the country to try to meet more that other whatever.
Right, exactly. That
yeah,
62%. Let's break through.
That
I
left
wish
over.
I could. I make the joke in a lot of public settings that I wish I could mail a Muslim out to every home in America, because I always say to people, like, when you know us, you love us, because the average Muslim is extremely hospitable, right? Many Muslim cultures from around the world, and Muslims come from every corner of the globe, but they're extremely hospitable. They're extremely open-minded for the most part. And I think that the complexity of human experience is so important to expose people to, because I have a good friend of mine now who I was the first Muslim that she met, and she was like, okay, so this is what Muslims are like. And then she met another Muslim and realized that, we had differences in our religious practice and in our culture and all of these things, and it was like, wait, this is complicated, and I think that that's exactly the kind of complication that we need to be able to process, is that being Jewish or Muslim or Christian or any other kind of category doesn't mean that you are one way. And it's sad that in this day and age, we have to get down to these basics to say, no, look, we're not all the same.
But it's demonstrated in Christianity. I mean, you have Lutherans, you have Baptists, you have Episcopalians. My mother's an Episcopalian, and I always say that's like Catholic light. And so there are distinctions within, the great traditions of religion.
But here in our country, people are exposed to those different traditions.
Well, yeah,
they're not
true.
as exposed to the different traditions that exist within Islam, which is, there's a vast variety of practice that takes place depending on where you're from and what kind of Islam you were taught growing up.
Well, and I think that geography also plays in a role. A lot of people don't know or understand that Indonesia is actually the most populous Muslim nation on the planet, and because there's this assumption there's just Saudi Arabia and the Middle East.
That's right.
But Bangladesh has a considerable, or India has a considerable Muslim population as well.
No, you hit it on the head. Asia and South Asia make up that's the most populous Muslim region in the world. We think about the Middle East as being the Muslim zone of the world, but when we think about the most populous Muslim zone of the world, we should look to Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia, because that's where the greatest concentration is.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how that's played out in the media. So, and who controls the media, and how possibly we can reshape it or at least have an impact. So my understanding is that you're on CNN on a regular basis. What is that experience like, being on the inside of that large entity of news media?
Well, I will first say that I'm grateful for every chance I get to be in that setting, because CNN still has, a global audience, and is the closest thing we have in mainstream media to neutral and unbiased. The closest thing. I wouldn't say that they are necessarily, and so I think it's an enormous platform. For me, the experience, quite honestly, is always the best comparison I make to people is that it generally feels a little bit like a car accident, where everything happens really fast. Afterwards, I'm not really sure, whether I got my point across or not, and it's only later when I review the tape that I kind of get a sense of what actually happened. But I think that, and so that's how I experience it personally. But on the other hand, I think that I've been doing this now for 10, 15 years. And I have noticed the change in the professionals I work with in the industry, whereas before there was a great deal more ignorance, even around pronunciation, saying Muslim instead of trying to say Muslim, or calling Muslims Islamic people rather than Muslims. I mean, just basic level knowledge.
Understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And now I think that over the years there has been a shift where these news media professionals are more hungry for stories and perspectives of mainstream Muslims. And in this current climate, I mean, I have to say that even more so, this current administration has created an opening within news media where there's a deep hunger to tell more stories of the marginalized and the potentially targeted. Unfortunately, it still bothers me. I can't help but still be bothered because we're still in the realm of bad news. You know, people get excited when they see me on TV, and I always sort of roll my eyes because it's not my proudest moment.
They only call you when
exactly,
something bad happens.
Exactly. That's what I tell people is, well, that
Because
just means that something bad happened.
Because you're supposed to explain it away, right?
Well, and not even explain it away, but when you're in a situation where the only time that you're going to see a mainstream Muslim is in the context of bad news, then even that mainstream Muslim is defined by bad news. Yeah. So what chance does the viewer have to be able to differentiate and to be able to see the credibility and the authenticity of the person who, you know, is trying to tell the story of everyday regular people?
So let's take an example. Mm-hmm. So there was, and there have been a couple of Jewish temples that have been burned, mm-hmm. Or synagogues, and my understanding was there was a large outpouring of mm-hmm. Muslim support, and to try to rebuild those buildings, and then to help anyone who was injured or damaged in those. Mm-hmm. Are those types of, do they call you when that happens, and then do you get to explain those or talk about those?
Sort of. So in those situations, and this was a silver lining situation where with the desecration of Jewish cemeteries and of synagogues as well, there were a couple of activists that put together a crowdsourcing campaign mm-hmm. online, and they raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to help put those cemeteries back together and help those families. The same thing just happened with the recent horrific attack in Portland, where the three heroic white men, right, stood to defend these two young African American women, one of them being Muslim. Two of them lost their lives. A crowdsourcing campaign was set up to support them and their families. Over $600,000 was raised, and not exclusively by Muslims, but the majority of it. And I think that reflects the outpouring. It reflects the heart of our community, which is a community that sees itself as being part of the fabric of our country, but also feels constantly targeted and constantly put under suspicion. And so I think that certainly news media have been more open to telling these stories, and I think because there is money involved and because there are large amounts of money that are getting raised to support victims, that those stories are getting told. But again, the unfortunate reality is that they're just going to be like a blip compared to, it's going to get probably a 90-second mention. It's not going to get a full segment or something more extensive. It might be the zinger at the end of the newscast that's that heartwarming story. But it's hard to make those things stick. Where I have hope is with new media. I think that digital media, social media, new media provide new platforms that can help change the dynamics.
And let's talk about that for a minute, mm-hmm. in particular, because I think a lot of the younger viewers or audience are getting their media from Twitter, mm-hmm. from Facebook. It's on their phones, as mm-hmm. opposed to, I thought that was a very nice nostalgic sort of look of your family, mm-hmm. On the couch watching Peter Jennings. But that's not common these mm-hmm. days. So when you talk about new media, and it's obviously it's a technological advancement, but how does that manifest itself, and then how can people either participate in it mm-hmm. or control it or utilize it?
Yeah. I think it's giving us so much more access. When I started out, I was beholden to the gatekeepers. They're meaning at these networks, right? So when we were pitching stories or pitching to get on air, it was down to a handful of producers, right? At CNN, MSNBC, the big networks, and those people, one yes, one no, that was everything, right? And you couldn't get beyond that. Mm-hmm. Now there is such a proliferation of media platforms that things have changed. And I'll give you one example that drove this home for me. So I put we put a lot of emphasis on CNN and mainstream media as being the way to reach America, right? Everyday America. Anything that I've done on CNN has maximum received, let's say, definitely under even 1 million views, to be even kind to myself. I did a couple of years ago, BuzzFeed, talking about new media, mm-hmm. invited me to come into their studio and sit down with 3 or 4 young women from their staff who had decided that they were going to wear hijab for the day to see what it would feel like. And
they weren't Muslim.
No, they weren't Muslim. They're just regular
They-
members of the BuzzFeed staff who wanted to experience what it felt like. So
Yeah.
they brought me into the studio.
But did they do it outside the studio?
Yeah.
too?
They
so
went,
like going to Starbucks?
Exactly. No, they lived their lives for the day. In fact, one of them had to get on a plane that evening to
and
travel
she kept
to
it
New York,
on.
and she kept her scarf on. So they brought me in to explain the hijab, to tell a little bit about my story, and then the rest is them going about their day. And they did pre-interviews and post-interviews with these young women, turned it into a short video of maybe 5 minutes. That video, since it was first released, has received something like 8 million views. And so to me,
Wow, that's like John Oliver territory.
that's what, yeah. So to me, this new media space is the space where we can tell our own stories on our own terms. That it was still in a stereotype kind of framework, but it wasn't labeled that way, and it was more experiential. And it was a place where I got to tell my human story in a different way, and it's that much more far-reaching. So to me, when I think about, I don't love social media, I have to say, but personally, but it's such a phenomenal platform, because instead of relying on the gatekeepers to decide who gets in and who's out, and we were talking about mainstream media, something like 8 or 9 companies own the vast majority of media outlets across the country.
Yeah, well, probably globally too.
I don't have my
Maybe it's
information
10.
doesn't extend that far, but it's such a concentration of decision makers. And new media, social media, YouTube, these various platforms are busting through all of the traditional media methods. And that to me is what gives me hope, because there are far more people now who are getting exposed to Muslims for the first time through something like a web series called The Secret Lives of Muslims. That's an awesome web series that follows everyday Muslims who, kind of like The Power of One, right? Who are neat, just interesting people who are doing interesting things, and it's made for a general audience, and that those videos are getting a ton of views. So I think it says something about the changing media landscape, and I also think that maybe this is too hopeful, or it is hopeful, but I think
I'm going to ask you a question that's not as hopeful.
Sure. Well, I think I'm hopeful that I think that people are looking for alternate media sources, and the distrust of mainstream media today, that's quite understandable, and that I share in many cases. The leverage point, or the opportunity in that crisis, is that people are seeking out different kinds of media outlets, and so the more information that we can put out there, hopefully it becomes that much more accessible.
Yeah. So here's where the Lord of the Rings sort of scenario comes in, is if there are only companies or corporations that are controlling it, and then you have all this new media or I would say grassroots information coming up, wouldn't they want to control it in some way or limit it? And if so, how might they do that?
Now let's roll up our sleeves and get into conspiracy theories. The thing that comes to my mind is the challenge of social media because of algorithms, right? That decide what shows up in your newsfeed.
Yeah.
So that while these new mediums exist out there, and we're trying to preach beyond the choir, are we only exposed to the same choir because of how our feeds work, right? That you end up seeing the same stuff from the same people, and you're not getting access to that broader sort of set of information out there. I think unfortunately it puts that much more responsibility on the individual to be a critical media consumer, and yet I don't know that we are capable of that by and large. And I think when it comes to young people, something that I talk to educators about informally is the importance of media literacy in the classroom, because with I have a almost 3-year-old and an almost 6-year-old, and they're pretty media savvy already. They can get around on the smartphone, but it's only a matter of time until they will be able to consume news on their own. And in this age of fake news, we can only imagine how much worse it's going to get before it gets better. But that media literacy needs to be part of the core curriculum, so that our young people are able to navigate this new digital world. I mean, they're digital natives, right? So this new digital world so that they can discern good information from bad information.
And I think that is a critical question. How do you understand? How do you take what's being sometimes thrown at you or you're being bombarded by, and to be able to understand it in a way so that you can decipher what potentially is falsehood and what is veracity. But without those, I think, analytical skills that are taught at an early age, I think some people are just, whatever they see over and over and over again, that's what they default to, that's what they believe in.
Well, and you know, so I did my master's degree in communications, and the one thing that stuck with me out of that experience was that when people are given the choice between facts and their feelings will generally be the default, that they will ignore the facts that do not correspond with their feelings rather than accepting a set of facts that defies what their feelings are. And that's, I think, the greatest challenge. And it's one of the reasons that, to me, you know, I will still go on CNN or on other media outlets. I think it's critically important, but I don't think that those are the spaces to change people's hearts and minds. I think that the spaces of changing hearts and minds is more the up close and personal relationship building, that's ultimately what does change somebody's heart and mind, and being able to, again, do that storytelling. And you know, you had, when we look at African Americans in our country, you needed to have a Richard Pryor and a Bill Cosby and a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and you know, this whole cycle of Hollywood portrayals that would allow for a normalization to take place. That's currently the stage that we're at as Muslims too. We're looking here at news media, but Hollywood and creative media are just as important, because people often feel, you know, when you don't have exposure to somebody of a different background or life experience than you, television, films give us that intimate feeling of knowing somebody who's, you know, in a very different place than us. So we need more Muslims, not just behind the cameras, but in front of the cameras.
Oh, absolutely. But just real briefly, because we don't have a whole lot of time left, how do you get people to come together and break bread or listen to each other's stories?
So I think that we need to create as many venues as possible. So in addition to my work with the Muslim Public Affairs Council, I'm active in multi-faith community building. So I am a co-founder of a group called New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change that was founded in the city of LA 10 years ago. And it was with the idea that leader-level dialogue, bringing, you know, rabbis and imams or community leaders together, only accomplishes so much. What we need to do instead is to build the relationships between everyday people, where we talk honestly about our faiths, our challenges, Israel-Palestine, and we get to the really hard work of improving our city and talking about things that impact both of us here.
Yeah, on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day basis. And what we have done in the last 10 years is we've graduated over 200 fellows. We've had thousands of people attend our programs. We have an annual storytelling night, again, the power of stories. And it's through these relationships. People start out as strangers, they end up family. These are lifelong connections that they're making. So because of that experience, that's where I'm the most deeply invested. And at this point in my career, I've decided to shift to becoming a consultant so that I can be freewheeling and decide which projects I want to work on. Because to me, in this post-election environment, the thing that I'm most fixated on personally is evangelical Americans, because 80-some percent of them voted for Donald Trump against their own self-interest, and I feel like that we need to be talking to them the most.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk to you more, but we have to wrap up for today. So thank you very, very much for being here on the show.
My pleasure.
Today.
Thank you.
It was fantastic.